I'm going to fix this.
All right, we're live, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Analog Astronaut Conference for our Diversity and Inclusion panel. I'm Dr. Tanya Harrison, your moderator for the panel today, and we've got a great collection of panelists here. So we're going to go around the horn and have everybody give a couple-minute introduction of themselves. So since Makiah, you're next to be on the screen, let's go with you.
Awesome. Can you hear me all right?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. Well, howdy. My name is Makiah Eustice. I'm an aerospace engineer by trade, and side gig is doing analog missions. I've done 3 analog missions, one notably in Utah and another one at high seas in Hawaii. But right now I am a U.S. Air Force officer, and my most recent job has been in structures. So I'm really interested in things like habitat operations, 3D printing, manufacturing, off this world, and different types of human factors in aerospace performance. But yeah, and then also in my free time, I like to play the mountain dulcimer and sing and kind of write songs and stuff. So I do other things besides just play around in habitats.
I should hope so. We all need to be balanced humans, right? I guess let's keep going down a mirrored video. Keep going down this direction with the next introductions.
Hi, this is Yvette. I'm Yvette Gonzalez. I'm based in Berlin. I'm from the States, and I'm a bioastronautics researcher and currently with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences. I'm also mission control and backup for the Austrian Spaceport mission. So nice to see everyone and to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. Let's go down the next row. Niko, how about you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Niko Blanks. I'm a senior at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. I'm studying spaceflight operations, and I went on my first analog mission this past December at high seas. And so, yeah, I'm really happy and excited to be here.
And Bailey?
Hi, everyone. My name is Bailey Burns. Generally just an excited person, so very excited to be here and see all these familiar faces. I'm an aerospace systems engineer with a company called Paragon Space Development Corporation, and we do life support for extreme environments, space being the most extreme. Previously, I was working on HLS for the Dynetics proposal, but it looks like I'm going to get a shift in what I'm going to be working on soon. But no matter what, we're looking at how we keep humans alive in space. And I think that was a really important thing to look into when I did my high seas mission in September. That was the first high seas mission out of COVID, or out of quarantine, I guess. So it's kind of like its own form of quarantine. So that was a really fun thing to experience. And I'm really interested in understanding kind of the human factors and even the crew dynamics a little bit. So this panel is really, really interesting to me specifically. And like Makiah said, I've got outside activities too. I'm graduating with my master's in space resources in like 3 weeks here. I've got papers to do. I am the space cuber that you guys see online. I'm the one that wants to solve a Rubik's Cube in space, and I got all sorts of other activities just to make space fun. So I'm really excited to be here today and to talk to you guys about diversity in analog astronaut missions.
Great. And Yvette, I think you're next on my screen.
I think I already went.
Oh, sorry. There aren't any names showing up on my screen. So next to Bailey. My apologies. Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rochelle. I am a medical doctor, so I'm an intensive care doctor. We've been in the news quite a lot recently because of the COVID pandemic. I also do acute medicine, and I'm here because I'm the chief medical officer for the Austrian Space Forum. And I have been part of the crew for the Glacier mission in Amity 15, as well as in Oman in the desert in Amity 18. So I've done a few analogs so far as an analog astronaut as well. So that's where I come from.
Great. And Mick, you want to round us off? It looks like Anushree is having connection issues, so hopefully she'll be back in a few minutes.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Oh, we can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'm so sorry. I think it's an internet problem and I couldn't properly hear the voices. So yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Anushree and I'm a PhD student of astrobiology at the Open University UK, where I am basically focusing on understanding the habitability of saline environment of Mars by taking a kind of combination of analog and experimental approach. So I've also been part of a long-term Mars simulation mission, both in the Utah desert and in the Arctic Circle, which is called Flashline Mars Arctic Research Station. So I've spent 5 months working in the simulation. So our mission was kind of divided into 2 chapters. So first 3 months I spent in Utah desert.
Oh, we lost her again. Well, Mac, I would say go ahead with your intro, and then if we get Anushree back, we'll have her kick off the rest of her introduction.
Sure. I am not the professional in this group, so I'm happy to be the learner, learning from you guys as a lifelong learner. I come from the petroleum equipment industry. I'm a petroleum equipment systems engineer and businessman by day, superhero by night. So, which means space fan and science fiction fan as well. So I started a company called Borderless Labs, and I'm very happy and humbled to be sponsoring today's event, especially for being inclusive and diverse. And that's precisely why I started the company, so I can bring space and science and STEAM education to underserved communities around the world in their own languages, and hopefully inspire them to be contributing communities to the space industry as well.
That's fantastic. I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully Anushree can connect back in and join in the conversation. So the first question to kick off the panel is for anybody that wants to kick in and answer first. Do you think that there's still a lack of diversity when it comes to the people involved in analog research? And if so, why do you think that is?
Would you like to point someone out first, or should I be the bad guy?
I can go first. I can see we're all very polite.
No, I'm usually the controversial person to say no after people pat each other on the back. But no, I'll start and I'll say I'm pretty pleasantly happy to see that analog research and analog astronaut programs are probably one of the most inclusive and diverse groups in this industry. That being said, this is one of the worst industries I've ever encountered when it comes to diversity in general. Just even gender representation is not equal. And when I used to hear about inclusion of women in space, as a space fan at the time, I was like, what's the big deal? You have women astronauts. And, I didn't really understand it until I really got into the industry. And then once I really saw legit discrimination, I was like, wow, you guys really treat women like crap. And the more I started seeing this industry, I'm starting to see it headed towards the right direction. And I think it's probably because of the good steps made by people who are in the analog community have shown that if you want to make change, you have to be the change instead of just talking about it. And I think the diversity and inclusiveness we see in analogs is starting to allow the rest of the industry to take note.
Yvette, did you want to chime in? You had something to say there?
Yes, I'm really glad to hear that. I guess the question also is, what do we mean when we say diversity, right? Because it can be so many things. There's a broad spectrum of, are we talking about age? Are we talking about culture? Are we talking about language? Talking about science and discipline, like what my background is and what the makeup of an analog is. Is it all medical doctors, or do we have a mix? So when we talk about diversity, it's also to be clear about, what are we specifically pointed to? Because he's right. I can see in many, analogs across the world, just depending on what area it is, how accessible. There's even a call for, is diversity also socioeconomic access? Can you afford to go, or are you being paid to go? I think we think about all these things when that loaded term diversity comes up, is where do we start? And that way we can have a conversation around those, and all of those conversations are very different, right? But I think he's absolutely right. I mean, this panel is such an example of all the people involved in trying to be part of the solution, offer concrete ways to work together, and then come out of that and express that out in the world and say, here's what I learned, here's what's happening, here's how you can get involved. I think that's part of also when you think you don't see diversity is, okay, so if I don't see it, what do I proactively do about it? I would tend to agree that there is a lot of diversity because you see a growing number of analogs. So I am very optimistic by nature, but I do, in this community, feel a sense of wanting to have a broad spectrum and being inclusive. So that's just my perspective right now.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in there. I think that's an excellent point, Yvette. And yes, this panel is just the definition of diversity. It's very exciting to see us get an actual diverse panel for a diversity panel. I think this super cool thing about the analog environments is that we have a lot of those barriers of entry that a lot of us kind of have to overcome are decreased. A lot of times in the space industry, you have to be a US citizen to work at NASA and all these different things. But analogs, you guys have seen there's analogs popping up all over the world. And as we are growing the world presence, we've got a lot of international efforts, which is leading to the cultural diversity that Yvette alluded to. I'm always really excited to see all these different women in power in the analog situations, and like running high Cs and running MDRs, and like all these amazing women are the ones in the power seats that can help start that conversation up. So I think exactly what Yvette's talking about, this is the environment to start having these conversations, and that's really exciting to see in the future.
Can I chime in?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, so I think that from my perspective, from a medical perspective, I think that there's also a psychological diversity and a richness there in culture that we need to embrace a bit more in the analog community. I think historically it's been not very diverse, and I think we're changing and evolving as the world around us evolves, but we still have a long way to go in order to become more inclusive. And since I became Chief Medical Officer for the Amity 18 mission and thereafter, I've tried to reflect my beliefs on the board, on the leadership board, to try and select crew and analog astronauts that reflect that diversity that we're trying to achieve. So I hope for the Austrian Space Forum, at least, we're trying to be more inclusive and trying to get more people involved.
Is harkening back a little bit to Bailey and Yvette's points, this reminds me a little bit of a conference I was at a few years ago where most of the programming for the day set by the conference programmers were older white men in the industry. And at some point, they asked the folks in the audience who were all space professionals or students under the age of 35 to create their own panel to talk about the future of the industry. And when you looked at who they self-selected to represent the younger generation, it was an extremely diverse panel. It did not look anything like the programming that the conference had put together. And so I feel like we're seeing that same thing here in the analog industry, or not industry, but the analog community. I'm so used to thinking space industry. My apologies there. Like seeing people deciding that they want to come together to make this community and make it better than it has been traditionally. So it's amazing to see what the folks that we have here. I guess Niko or Makiah, did you have anything you wanted to add on this question?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. For me, I've never had a struggle like looking and finding somebody that like looks like me in the space industry or on analogs, because there's a lot of white men in the space industry, but for me it came from looking for other people that had disabilities or were cancer survivors that were going to space or participating in research. And I think that it's really encouraging to see so much diversity, especially in recent years with the number of analog missions coming up. But I do think that there is still a long way to go for the disability side of having all types of people, no matter what kind of medical history or things that they didn't choose to deal with in their life, get the opportunity to participate in analogs and, hopefully actually get to go to space for real as well. So that's coming from, I guess, my perspective on it.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I feel very lucky from my experiences at least to like have a mix of like usually international crew, very young as a student to actually have the opportunity that was like financially possible. Like it's still iffy, but financially possible. I could do it, and then having those opportunities that like rolled in later. So going back to like what actually is accessible. I think financially is like a huge barrier. And I've had people come to me or brainstorming like, oh, wait, so like, do I need to start a GoFundMe? Like, how can I do this and stuff like that? And it also depends on your field too, because we know that how you intersect with like, especially like geosciences, physics and other fields, the barriers that are within those fields already, may be amplified when it comes to who actually gets to lead studies and get funding to do these type of things. So that's just another perspective I'd add.
Whoop, sorry about that. I said absolutely. What can analog missions do to try and help combat inequality in all the different ways that we've just been discussing?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing I always think about, like I said, I'm really interested in the crew dynamics and human factors of all this. And I think one of the best things we can do is just kind of like listen. I know that sounds like super simple, but as we're having these conversations, a lot of the times in the habitat when we're designing these things, all these different areas, is just bringing these people to the table and giving them a voice, a chance to be heard. And that's the biggest thing. I know it's one of those, it's like, it sounds so simple, but like, how do we actually do this? And I think this conference specifically is a great example of us beginning to work towards that in the future, and opening those opportunities, kind of like what Makiah was saying with the socioeconomic issues and everything like that. It's going to be saying, okay, this is where we're going, but let's take a step back and ask, where do you need help? Where can we reach out and help you? Whether that be, socioeconomic, education, anything like that, there's definitely ways to help. We just have to be asking those questions and listening to the feedback we get back.
I'd like to jump in as well, and I just say there hopefully is a plan. I mean, and this is what I would hope for to increase exactly what was just said about the financial aspect about accessibility because of finance. It would be wonderful if one aspect of increasing diversity was making either the cost point much more affordable or finding ways to come together as a community and create a lot of influence to impact having scholarship funds and maybe finding ways that those marginalized communities, I mean, all of us here today are connected to each other because we've either done an analog or we're friends or we're colleagues and we knew each other. We're in a network already and we have the privilege of having that network, right? So when we think about those marginalized communities who don't have that network or maybe don't even know what an analog is, I was listening to Cyan earlier and she said people are always asking, what is that? What is an analog? What does that mean? Not just being able to share that message, but then say, here's how you get access. And one of those access points, I have to say, I've heard it over and over is, I don't have money and I don't want to crowdfund. So how do I do this? And being able to create those avenues and share that on forums, on social media, at universities, and say, these are the different ways that you can afford to go. And here are the companies that want to go because they've seen credible, high fidelity science and research come out of them. And if we can start kind of bridging the outcomes to the want and desire to fund these, or the desire and ability of the actual habitats to have money to fund people to come in and do research, I think we're going to start creating those connections to really get a lot more of those marginalized groups involved. So I would hope that that's one pathway forward.
Absolutely. I think funding is going to play a huge difference here. Sorry, go ahead, Mac.
As the resident older guy in the panel, I could probably remember when Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Wozniak used to talk about their vision of a computer in every home. And people who didn't have vision used to laugh at that, even politicians and everything. I'm sure some people in the audience would remember and reminisce about those times. And now I'm one of those people who believes in the vision of millions of people living and working in space. In order to accomplish that, that means we have to train millions of people to live and work in space and not die, because space wants to kill you every chance it gets. And analogs is the way to do that. You're going to need employees. You're going to need companies who are going to need accommodations, and they're going to have their own locations in space, habitats in space, and all of that needs training, needs personnel training, just like we have companies that train personnel on safety, and it's regulated when you're going down to a mine, or you're doing excavation or construction, or even something as simple as driving or flying has a huge industry of preparing those professionals for those tasks. There's no better way to do it through no other better way to do it than analogs. And since it's going to be a worldwide, millions of people living, working in space, just like, a lot of people in the panel have talked about, the richness of culture is not only going to be something that's going to help, but it's going to be something that's necessary, because you're going to have all types of industries that are going to be a factor in space. Space is just going to be a place, just like the oceans and just like the land, that all industries are going to need to work. And if we share that vision of millions of people living and working in space, then analogs we're still in the infancy of this industry, and we're glad to basically be a part of it.
I think that's really important. And I'd just like to pick up on the fact that even though a lot of the space crews are really diverse, we share a culture of space, of being interested in this vision of going somewhere beyond, and also creating something and researching something where we can have benefits for terrestrial settings as well. And I think that that's really important, that space for Earth link. And I'd like to say that when going forward, we need to change the limitations that people have, that we've found in our own past retrospectively, but also our mentees are finding along the way, and convert them into enablers, like Yvette said. And I think we need to think about how we can do that as we progress in our careers within our own companies, or within the industry, as Tanya was saying, as a whole, and also trying to create advocates in each of those different settings to make that possible. And I think like going forward, something that I'm really passionate about is the Space Generation Advisory Council, and having centralized locations where these companies and industry can host scholarships. And the SGAC is one of the places that I'm really passionate about, that's moving these things forward, where you're having conversations happen in different settings, in different places, in different countries, with different people. And I think that that's really important going ahead.
Absolutely. SGAC is such a great interface for networking with people all around the world, tons of different backgrounds. I've learned so much from the different people that I've met through that network about, space agencies around the world and what they've been working on. So it's really amazing. If anybody that's watching is under 35, you can join SGAC for free. So definitely check out their website. Did anybody else want to add anything on this topic before we move on?
And join the Space Medicine Life Sciences group.
So I just wanted to bring up, because this has reminded me of something I've heard before, or was a discussion within the space community, is, the people that are in power, we know the people that are the movers and have the weight behind them and everything. Those people, including us, but especially, those people need to, if there's something that is not befitting of our community, the buck stops there. It's kind of like, hey, if the the panel is not going to be representative, if we are intentionally or unintentionally leaving people off the table, or leaving them silent, or not empowered, then the buck stops there. No, we need to stop. We need to fix this. Not kind of just going along, well, things kind of progress slowly. And even though that is true, we need to figure out how to not tolerate it, because, we have an urgent mission. It's for, decades and centuries of wanting to get to space, but we need to know that we need to make as much change now. So let's just change right now. Like, we're not going to move until we actually fix this problem. So I think that's important for us, and also especially the people who are the big movers.
That ties in really well to the next question, actually. What can individuals do to increase diversity, both in the industry and in the analog sector, like seeing people come into these missions in general?
I think there's like two sides to it. There's those that have a story that are really empowering and really important, that they use their voice to reach out to the communities they're a part of, and lift up people around them that have gone through or are going through similar circumstances that they had the fortunate ability or opportunity to get through. And then there's those that are already have that fortune, that they have it maybe a little bit easier, that they use their voice as well to help lift up everybody around them, no matter whether they personally identify with a certain group or culture, or we're all lovers of space, and we all love research and being a part of this awesome community, whether it be analog astronauts or just the space community as a whole, or the entire world. And it's important that we all as individuals are reaching to everyone we can to help make everybody's opportunities as wide as possible.
I'd like to add, I really agree with Niko. There's something about it doesn't matter where you are in your career, it doesn't matter your age, your background. Again, the diversity that you have a voice to tell your story, and every story counts. There's something to be said about somebody with a disability being able to be invited into an analog and feel comfortable to be doing that. And I work with, deaf and hearing impaired, and I'm very cognizant that there's some things that are limitations because they haven't been invited yet, but we just have to build that around it. And being very cognizant of what it is that is inaccessible, and flipping it. So one thing that I'm really always looking for are resources. So something today somebody can do, and I'm not plugging, she didn't know I was going to do this, but there's a book on principles that I think are really beautiful, and it just came out. Dr. Don Marsden did the Indigenous Principles for the Starship Citizen. And this book it's a booklet, and it's intended to feed into analogs. That's her hope. And I looked at it and I thought, I have Native American and Mexican heritage. Everyone here has a beautiful heritage that they bring to the table alongside their discipline, alongside their gender, alongside their own life experience. And how do we share those resources? So if there can be a repository of putting, like, here are some books that can help guide principles of analogs, principles of inclusion. If there can be a hub like we're creating now, right, as a community, for us to put these resources. One thing is to share those resources and to amplify those resources. And the other thing is also, and Rochelle can attest to this, the Austrian Space Forum, in my experience so far with training with analogs, is a masterclass in training. And it is international, and I would say there's something to be learned from the Austrian Space Forum approach that can be used for inclusion and diversity around the world, to say, here is like a high credible way to get involved, and here's how you can be part of it, because we're just, everybody's coming in, we're just ordinary people, but you come into that and you feel suddenly like, wow, I feel very equipped to be part of something. And you can share that with others. So I think it's finding, how do we share resources? How do we make that open source? And then how do we make sure that we're reaching those communities that are really far-reaching, and those far-flung places that maybe there's children in Indonesia that want to be part of this. I know there's communities in Africa that want to be part of this. And so making sure we include them in that dialogue. So hopefully we'll have that through this community.
In other words, space for all nations.
Absolutely.
I
Let's
really
take a
like
couple questions.
the
Oh,
story.
sorry.
And I really like the stories, like the story of Dr. Cyan Proctor, who proudly will be going on the Inspiration 4 mission into space soon. We're very happy and proud, of her. That she put this whole thing together, her and Jazz. That's amazing. Thank you. But I remember one of the things that inspired me to do what I'm doing with refugees and with underserved communities is when she said, I never felt inspired by the stories of these astronauts because none of them looked like me. None of them spoke like me. None of them had the same stories or experiences. So that's where inclusion is not just about feeling good about ourselves and patting ourselves on the back that, hey, I'm a good person because I involved an other. But no, when you include someone, you're not only changing their life, you're changing the life of an entire community that looks at that person and says, hey, that can be me one day. So when you see someone who looks like Malala going to space, that means every Pakistani girl wearing a hijab says, I can be a scientist or an engineer or go to space one day. When you're watching Shark Week, instead of the middle-aged man in the shark cage, if you see a woman wearing a hijab in a scuba suit, in the shark cage, speaking in Indonesian or speaking in Urdu or speaking in Arabic, about sharks, not about women's rights or about human rights or about diversity or anything, just talking about species of sharks. You've already changed hundreds of millions of lives of young girls who can say, hey, I can be a scuba diver, oceanographer one day without even having to say a word. Just their presence in that field is enough to change the world. So you don't have to go out and preach. All you got to do is include. And that's why this panel, to me, is the genesis of what I'd like to see as inclusion the way it's supposed to be. My name is Mac, and I'm done speaking.
So let's move on to some questions from the audience. We've got a question from Darsh. What impact did your involvement in the space industry how did it affect your views on inclusivity, like observations or events that changed your thinking? I see lots of thoughtful faces across the panelists.
I can go first. I think, the first conference I ever went to was a medical conference on aerospace medicine in the US. And I got a scholarship to go because I couldn't afford to go as a student. And when I got there, part of the scholarship was to go to the gala night. I didn't even have a dress. I had to borrow a dress and shoes. I still remember all of this. I know, first world problems, but anyway. But I remember sitting at this table and I was the only woman and I was the only brown person on that table. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, is this what space or space medicine is? And, I'd been really passionate about this area as a first year, as a second year, and I was there as a third year going, oh my goodness, I can't see anyone that looks like me. Do I even belong here? So I think that changing that attitude of, yes, everyone belongs here. And it doesn't matter who you are, as long as you like the area, you're passionate about contributing in some way. And it's trying to make sure that we get the message out that everyone belongs, right? And it's very difficult to do, and it's still something we're addressing. And like Max said, this is the first step, having a platform like this. But I just remember that, and that really stuck with me. And I was thinking, how can I change this? Because I want more people around that understand my life experience and where I come from. So I think that's really important to do, that we have really important voices that we should be sharing, or we can be advocates for other people from all cultures and agendas and everything to try and involve them in the analog and space industry.
One of the things that Yvette said that I found very powerful in the beginning is, how do we even define diversity? What kind of diversity are we talking about? And everyone has their own standard. And one of the things that I think we haven't spoken about that I'm trying to address is linguistic diversity. Everyone talks about white privilege and this privilege and that privilege, or socioeconomic privilege, but nobody talks about linguistic privilege. The language of science is English, period. When I left the Arabic world in 1999, the entire scientific database of the world was English. It's still Carl Sagan, still David Attenborough, David Suzuki on television, but with 2 lines of text. When I went to visit, and 20 years later, or 19 years later, they've evolved. Now it's dubbed. But it's still Carl Sagan and David Attenborough and the middle-aged white guy on television, and people don't see themselves and they don't hear their language from people like that. So 20% of the world's population speak English. The other countries that are watching us today are watching us because they understand the English language, and the rest of the 90% of their populations don't, and they don't have that content by their own representatives in their own language. So yes, there's a long way to go, and I'm glad there are forums like this to enable us to at least ask the question. I'm not giving any answers, but at least address and ask those questions and bring light to them, and at least tell the people who are running, whether it's these programs or even in their own lives, or as individuals, that this is probably something to think about. I know the most brilliant minds, and you probably see them in your own companies. The only most brilliant ideas and inventions that you come up with and hear about are from someone who just can't verbalize and vocalize and sell that concept because they're just struggling to find the grammatically correct word to form a sentence, let alone talk about, thrust to weight ratio or something that's just incredibly brilliant, but they just can't sell it. And that breaks my heart. So to be able to do that in their own language, or just have a spokesperson sell it thereafter, that would be a huge step. Yeah,
and I kind of want to go off of that, because that made me think of a really amazing experience I had 2 years ago when I attended the International Space University in France. And this is the first time I've been to Europe, just after graduating with my degree. So I was like, I'm really cool, and I did this thing and everything. And I get into this environment where it's like people from everywhere, all professions, people who have been in mission control and in Israel, and entrepreneurs and stuff. I'm like, what the heck is going on? And of course, our classes were taught in English. You hear English in so many different accents, but the limiting factor is how much people have been exposed to English, especially with their Chinese peers that came over. It was very difficult for them to socialize the same way. So there's cultural differences, and linguistically, it was we had to get through a barrier. So they're already at a different disadvantage, not just with the classes, but to just conversate with everyone and get that networking, which is the real benefit of being there. So I think that was a big thing. But another aspect of that was, even though of course we're all international and this was a very broadening experience for me, I was still only one of 2 Black people there. And I was the only Black woman, and there was only 1 person or 2 people from Africa. So, it was there's still a big gap, obviously, of who has the the national backing, and there's a lot of things that tie into that I can't really get into right now. But it was very enlightening for me as an American to see that. But at the same time, you see it's very obvious who's not there.
That was one thing Sorry. One thing I wanted to point out, specifically what you just said, Makiah and Rochelle and everything, when I really noticed it was in college. I had already made the decision I was going to go off to be an engineer. In my mind, I was already an engineer. I'm doing this. And then when you get to the table and you look around and you already have this big dream, but there's no one that looks like you, no one to, actually the biggest thing for me is no one thought like I did. I'm far more of like, I like people. I'm an extroverted engineer, which is kind of a rare breed. And so not having those people who think like I do and that want to make those connections like I do was very difficult for me. And so it's opening up, it's called the STEM pipeline. It's keeping people in the STEM pipeline interested in these things because they feel accepted and welcome to the table. We already all have the passion to go to space. We're already all here. We now need to stay here and do this together.
I think, another aspect, Mac, you made me consider in this conversation, I love because we do want to talk about this. This is something that should be an open conversation, an open dialogue on the table. But one other aspect of diversity is also religion and spiritual beliefs, and that occurred to me, this week when I was reading the principles I told you about. And it was, there also is this comprehension that we have very different approaches to ourselves and the environment and the world around us, depending on our culture. There's where we were born, there's where we were nurtured, and then there's where we live now, right? And that arc is so fascinating because it makes you who you are, and it brings to an analog and to a team what you have experienced. And then that, we hope, comes together and it makes sense. And then if it doesn't, then we all have that also, that deductive reasoning to say, okay, how do we make it make sense? But when we talk about religion, we also have to have that conversation about that diversity, right? Do we see that range of diversity in analogs, and why not? And then how do we make it inclusive? How do we make safe spaces for that? How do we make sure that's understanding? There is a conversation with Mariba Jha that took place on Space Watch Global, and he brought together a representative of 5 different major religions. It was fascinating. It was like they were all so respectful to talk about what it means to be a future interstellar species, and what it does it mean to have your own belief systems, and what will that bring for the future. This Indigenous book was really like telling to say, oh, that's right. I feel connected to Earth, to sky and the stars in a very different way than somebody else might. And am I allowed to bring that into an analog? And am I allowed to have a community with me to have that conversation? I mean, these are the things we also have to be open to, right? To say, okay, when we talk about diversity, there's also this other huge bubble that isn't really mainstream conversation. And how do we make sure that we benefit all of these different spirituality in this range and be cognizant of that?
I'm going to ask a question pointed mostly toward Niko, but then if anybody else wants to discuss after that, like Niko, you mentioned disabilities at the beginning, and we haven't really touched on them much since. And as someone with a physical disability, that has actually been the main thing preventing me from doing an analog mission. I'm curious as to like your thoughts about diversity inclusion, specifically in terms of disabilities for analog missions, and how we can make more people with disabilities feel welcome to join something like this, when typically the perception of astronauts has been sort of the right stuff. You have to be really physically fit. You have to be able to go around and like hike in these spacesuits and things like that. So how do we change that to make it more inclusive?
I think that it's really encouraging to see how being like the opportunity to go to space is becoming so it's quickly becoming available to a lot more people and a lot more types of people, and especially people with disabilities. That's in the next 15 years, hopefully, we're going to start seeing people with real, physical disabilities and actually get to go to space and break that right stuff mold that you mentioned. And I think that the analog world, it's a similar kind of deal where it's an analogs are, they're marketed as being as realistic as possible as you can to go to space, and the simulation of living in an environment where you're limited on food and water and communication and everything. But we don't step back to think about how would we make this experience available for someone in a wheelchair or someone that's deaf or and I think it's a really important conversation to have and think about. And I think that the first step to going in that direction is to reach out to those communities and ask them, how would you want to make this opportunity as beneficial to you as it would be to the rest of the analog astronaut community, and how can we help make these experiences available to someone in a wheelchair that wants to see what it's like living on the moon or on Mars. And that's a really I don't have the answers, but it's a really important question to ask, definitely.
So does anybody else want to comment on that before we move on to more Q&A?
Just to add to that, I think it's really exciting that ESA's astronaut call is all about diversity at the moment, and it's trying to include in selection anyone who's on that spectrum of health. So I don't like to use the term disability because I think everyone's able. I think everyone is able in some way and has something to offer. And the patients that I see, I think a lot of them, especially when I treat peds or pediatric kids, some of them are so passionate about space, and they do have health limiting factors. But it's how, as a medical community, I think we're really starting to think about, now we're getting more commercial space flight passengers. We're getting more opportunities to go to space. How do we change that to adapt things to enable people? We need to understand a lot more about the human body in space, and we're not there yet because space is a very dangerous environment. As Mac said, there's everything around you in that environment that's so extreme that everyone would struggle with the spaceflight environment. But I think it's trying to work out, how do we get somebody in a wheelchair to the moon? And I think that I would love to see that happen in my lifetime. I think that would, for me, as part of a medical team, would be so exciting.
As a sci-fi fan, I know that if Geordi LaForge wasn't blind, they wouldn't have figured out how to develop a visor. If it's what was the exact words? Necessity is the mother of invention. So not only is that important on Earth, but it's important in space. We don't know yet how much innovation we're going to see that's going to benefit us here on Earth before we send someone into space and need to create and invent the technology basically to meet those needs. That's one thing on the technology side. On the other side, from the diversity and inclusion side, one of the things I reflect on as I hear you all speaking is diversity or lack of inclusion doesn't necessarily mean malice or racism or everything, because a lot of people think to the extremes of you're not included because we hate you, but it's most of the time just because it's an oversight and just not even having a second thought. And I am guilty of not including or not taking into account things like my very first analog that I held in Wadi Rum, country of Jordan, where they filmed The Martian and Star Wars and Transformers, Lawrence of Arabia, all those wonderful movies, because it's pretty much Mars on Earth. And we held that analog. It was spectacular, but it was just so physically demanding. And I loved the fact that it was physically demanding because it was drilled into my head that you got to be the right stuff. But I never took into account that physical needs are a thing until I listened to you, Dr. Tanya Harrison, on another panel, and you brought that to my attention. And then I started reflecting on all the things I've been doing over the years, and I was like, oh wow, I never even thought of that. So that's why we have these conversations, not to say, hey, you're evil, but just say, hey, this is a thing, and we need to account for that. Another thing I was incredibly guilty of is I had a huge number of guest customers that I was paying for. They were paying a lot of money to buy my products, and I had a get together with them, and I had a very delicious catering service, come and give them food. And two of the Hindu people came up to me and said, "Excuse me, where's the vegetarian option?" And that was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. There were none because I never thought of it. It didn't occur to me. And that's when I felt like an idiot. I was just so it didn't occur to me. So it's an oversight. I feel I'm the most inclusive person there, but it's one of those things that if it's not brought to people's attention, it's not because we're preaching, it's just because we're educating.
And to add on that, sorry, I think that, that whole, oversight that we all experience, we're all guilty of, comes from being in a mold that has been around for decades. And in order to break that mold is how you break that oversight. And, from when I myself was going through cancer treatment and I wanted to be an astronaut, my people told me, no, you can never do that. There's no astronauts with cancer or pediatric cancer survivors that are now astronauts. And that's really hard to hear from whether you are a cancer survivor or any other kind of background. And then and then you kind of lose that motivation when everybody's telling you no, no, no. And we need those people that are asking the questions, okay, how do we turn that no into a yes, you can, or how are we going to get you as close as possible to achieving your dreams if it is really difficult to achieve? So yeah.
Yeah, and Niko, I love your story about that. I think it's so true, and I'm glad that you were able to bring that diversity to this panel specifically. I think that's really important. And I think one of the things to bring this back to the analog world, that's why we're doing this, right? Is we've got all these questions. We're not going to have the first person in a wheelchair on the moon tomorrow. We're going to go through these analogs of figuring everything out. How do we do this? It's one of the reasons that diversity in analog missions is going to be so amazing. Like you said with Mac, the vegetarian option. Well, I promise you, if you had an analog with a vegetarian, that there's now going to be vegetarian options in space. Like, that's what we're doing here, is we're figuring out all these things here so that we can bring it to space and hopefully see that progress even faster.
It's me. I'm the vegetarian.
I think this all really nicely ties back. I think it was Yvette, you at the beginning, saying we all need to share our stories, because it is a lot of times not malice. It's just literally not thinking about these things, because if you've never experienced a certain situation or a certain perspective in your life, it's not naturally going to come to you. And so talking to everybody across all these communities is so important if we want to actually include them. So we only got a couple minutes left in the panel. So I think there's a great question from the audience for us to end on. Orestes wants to know, how can we use the analog mission experience and community to more directly help underrepresented people pursue formal education and careers in space? Maybe partnerships, fellowships, internships, things like that. If anybody has any thoughts here.
These analogs are perfect. Analogs are the perfect way to start and stem that and be the flagship inclusion analog astronaut programs that the rest of the space industry can follow. Because just like we've seen in other universities with foreign exchange students, this is perfect. This is the underrepresented communities can share their research. They don't have to, with analogs, they don't have to worry about ITAR and EAR and being a U.S. citizen, like you guys mentioned earlier in the panel. And I think more needs to be done. I think we need to knock on doors and make phone calls and say, hey, let's actually do some foreign exchange programs. There are a number of universities all over the world who would love to be a part of space. They want to be part of those millions of people living and working in space. And there are tons of people in Europe and North America who would love to just visit those countries and do their kind of research there. So foreign exchange student programs have worked for a very long time. And the space industry in general needs to adopt those programs because they've worked. And analogs, I know, do have programs like that. And I know everyone follow Yvette on social media because she's probably one of the flagship people who is a champion of that cause. So I think analogs can be the definite leader in this industry when it comes to that type of those types of partnerships and fellowships.
I love that, Mac. Thank you. And actually, borderless is kind of what we want, right? We want to be able to break down these barriers for everyone, and in any little way we can. So for us, we have at the Institute, Bailey's also working there too, and we take courses and training in various different scenarios that you can be part of, and you can get that information at our website as well. Space for All Nations is an initiative for this community to connect you to analogs, to connect you to research and scientists. And the whole point of Space for All Nations is that anyone from an underrepresented group, marginalized or emerging space nation on any of that spectrum can reach out to us and ask, how do I do this? You know, I'm in school, I'm in high school, I'm in university, I'm in academia, or I'm at a government level position, and how can my country be there, be part of this? And so right now we actively are forging MOUs and partnerships with Ghana, Senegal, Indonesia, Egypt, and all of these partners came to us at very different capacities and said, can we be part of an analog? Can we be part of testing campaigns? Can we do our research and science? And can we actually have our students be part of that? And we said, yes, let's make a way. So it varies, like Max said, it looks different in every context because every context has a different starting point. But we would like to help to make those starting points accessible. So definitely there'll be contact information to reach out for that kind of outreach.
I think the coolest thing about this, honestly, is that, yes, there's a very high barrier of entry to space, and we're working on this with analogs. But if you guys are feeling that like diversity struggle, this is your way in. This is the door to break this down. We're part of a community that's here to help you get in. And I think that's a really exciting thing to be a part of.
I think that also we're all STEM ambassadors, right? We're all in some way or another, and we can reach out to schools, universities, like Mac was saying, universities in different countries. We have that, we're empowered to do that. And I think that I'm sure a lot of the members of the audience are also empowered to do that. And I don't know whether anyone's following Ignited Thinkers, but they're actually that's a college student who is going out and basically interviewing different people in the space community and trying to make their own platform to try and inform other young people of it. So there's a lot of near peer learning as well. So I think that there's lots of mechanisms to do this. And for the Amadi 18 Oman mission for Austrian Space Forum, we had Omani astronauts. So we made sure local people were involved as analog astronauts. And we actually invited local Omani school children to come and have a talk to us, especially like the females. And it was so great to see them engaging with our little experiments and everything. And to get an idea of what analogs are. So next time you're hosting an analog, make sure that you get the local community involved, and you can do that online as well as face-to-face, depending on like the COVID situation, right? But you have to make sure that you can be inclusive for every analog that you do. And I think that's all we can do as individuals, right?
Yeah, all the great answers. To tag along on that, I guess, like, just make sure the value is going to the community, going to the nation that needs it, not holding it up like, hey, here's a cool opportunity, holding up in the air, you know, with those barriers. Because I think, you know, a lot of diversity inclusion efforts, you know, they're kind of in a way compensating for like built-in injustices sometimes. So you got to be aware of like what's already there, so you can know that, hey, where we need to meet them where they are because of what's happening, and just be aware of like the situation overall. But yeah, put the value where it's supposed to be.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists and for everybody that tuned in today. We're running up on time here. So stay tuned for the next panel, which is on science communication and the arts among analog astronauts. So I'm sure that was going to be really fantastic. Look for all of our fantastic panelists on social media, and we hope to see all of you again soon. Thanks, everyone.